A very warm welcome to everybody. Where I'm sitting, it's absolutely sweltering. So I hope you've all got your glasses of water or gin and tonic or whatever near you. It's almost as if we were in the southern parts of Europe at this moment. Just to remind you that this webinar has derived from the International Committee. I wrote a lot about that in the Brexit Watch on the 12th of August, but just to rehearse one or two key points. The International Committee exists to promote a deeper understanding of the EU, its structures, purposes, achievements, plans, opportunities, and threats, in the context of EMUK's overall mission for the UK to secure the closest possible ties with our neighbours across Europe. And I think that mission is all the more important, given the pace of change since 2016 and the likelihood of even more change with our own elections and indeed the European Union's elections coming through in 2024. From an international committee perspective, the start of the new political year, which is how I see we are now, seems a very good time to stand a pace or two back from the day-to-day political events and to reflect more deeply on the nature of European unity, why we identify with our fellow continentals, and what history tells us about our ability to come together. And it's very hard to imagine anybody better qualified to speak on these matters than Neil MacGregor. He's a passionate pro-European whose books and BBC radio programmes on global themes have captivated audiences over many years. So Neil will speak for about 40 minutes, followed by a conversation with me on behalf of the International Committee, probably for about 20 minutes, followed by the audience questions, which Scott was referring to. Turning to Neil, I mean, he is an art historian, he's a writer, he's a BBC broadcaster, and a committed pro-European. His works include A History of the World in 100 Objects, Germany, Memories of a Nation, and Living with the Gods. He was director of the National Gallery and the British Museum in London, a founding director of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and has worked extensively with the Louvre, the Hermitage, and the Rijksmuseum, so all over Europe. I mean, in summary, Neil has a national and an international reputation as someone who draws on the past to illuminate the present and to provide guidelines for the future. He has a global reach, but I can tell you from long experience that his heartland is Europe. From studying French and German at Oxford to postgraduate studies in Paris, and then art history all over Europe. His book, Memories of Germany, is of course another great testament to his European credentials. And that's all apart from being the director of the National Gallery, followed by being director of the British Museum, and having relations with European museums all over the continent. He's actually been more than a museum director. He's been a cultural diplomat, often involved in political aspects of culture. And he had this huge role more recently in being chairing the organization that set up the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. I think we're very privileged to have his unique perspective with us this evening. And I think despite all his writings and radio broadcasts, I believe, Neil, this is the first time that you have spoken specifically about imagining Europe. And so we all look forward very much to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that very, very generous introduction. And yes, this is exactly as you say, the first time that I've tried to talk to ask questions really about how we can imagine Europe. Because when you and I have been talking about your work in the European movement and how to encourage greater British participation in the idea of Europe, one of the things that I became very interested in is the question of how we imagine political entities, what political entities need beyond bureaucracy, beyond constitutions. I think it's clear that any political entity, a nation or a group of nations, needs something more than that. It needs a story about what it is, what it has been, a mythology, if you like, about how it came to be and what its purpose is. And it needs symbols. symbols and images that can anchor it in the public memory and which help people to remember and to be inspired to be part of that political entity. And I want to talk this evening a bit about how Europe, the idea of Europe, can be given physical form, and how it has been, how we may do it, and also how we can talk about it. Because I presume we're all starting at the same point, that we want to encourage our fellow citizens to engage more fully in the kind of Europe that we want to be part of again, and which we want to play a very full part. So Scott has very kindly agreed he's going to move the images. Scott, could we move to the first image, please? So normally when communities are trying to find themselves, they talk about what they've been, what they've done. They talk about their past as a way of addressing and summoning their future. And that, I think, is what Europe has to do. Think about what it has been in order to articulate better what it wants to be, and then find images for that. Because that'll help others see us as we want to be seen, and help us keep an idea of where we're going and where we're heading. Because it's very hard, I think, for many people to imagine what Europe is beyond, obviously, the trade bloc. And if we start with how other people see us, can we have the first slide, please? It's often very hard for others. Can we have the next slide, please, Scott? Here is an American cartoon, if you like, of how, for the outsiders, Europe can look. This absurd image of all the stereotypes of the different constituent parts of Europe, it could have come out of a Nancy Mitford novel, really, couldn't it? This kind of approach to the abroad, to foreigners, no overarching idea, nothing shared generally. And Georgia on the far right, you can see the bewildering suggestion that this is actually part of Europe. And what on earth could that be about? This is how others see us, and frequently still do all around the world. But let's go to the next slide to think about how we see ourselves. And maps, I think, are a good place to start, because maps are the clearest visualization of where we think of our place in the world. And I don't know about most of you watching, but I grew up, at least, with this map of the world, very much part of my childhood. The fact that it was colored imperially was a hangover, of course. But what hasn't changed and never changed was the fact that Europe is in the middle, that the dominance of Britain and France ensured that the Greenwich meridian would be the basis for which time was measured across the whole of the world. Europe would be in the middle, and the dominance of France meant that the world would be measured in a metric system. Time and space controlled by Europe, Europe at the middle, Europe at the center of a world order. It's, of course, how Europe thought about itself, certainly throughout the 19th and a great deal of the 20th century. But if we turn to a more recent map, we can see that for the rest of the world, with the next slide, please, you can see a very different way of thinking about the world. This is a Chinese map produced about 10 years ago, showing how you can now imagine the world. And you can see at the bottom right, India and then China. And what you're looking at are possible sea routes through a melted Arctic Ocean. How you can sail from Shanghai to New York at the top, or to Rotterdam further down in the center. And from this view of the world, you can see Europe is certainly not any longer in the middle. This is a world where Europe is only a very small part of a constantly shifting and rapidly changing world order. Go to the next slide, please. But what is it then that holds us together? These nation states, this assemblage of nation states constantly expanding, although recently shedding us. What is it that we all share, and that we in our past and our future? And one of the things that I think quite strikingly we do share from our past is war, of course. That's the one thing we know. This is not a set of states a state of peoples that have traditionally lived together. And one area of war particularly has emerged almost as a kind of constant. Could we have the next slide, please? You're looking at a cartoon about 100 years old, of almost exactly a century ago, of the war in Ukraine. After the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Turkish and the Austro-Hungarian empires, Ukraine declared independence and was immediately attacked by the whites, by the reds, by Russia, by Balkan states, and by Poland, all of whom you can see here. Ukraine, the epicenter of European and beyond conflict. Ukraine, the place where Europe has to decide where it ends, what it is, and what it's going to be. It's no accident, I think, that that great geopolitical fault line is still with us today. We have the next slide, please, where exactly the same kind of fighting is going on about where Ukraine belongs, what Ukraine is. Now, though, with a unified Europe pulling together, of course, with the United States. But the question remains, how do we find a way of thinking that holds all of us together other than war against an outside enemy, an outside threat? What is it that holds us together? It's a challenge that every nation state has thought about and had to solve over the last couple of 100 years. And for most of the nation states of Europe, the solution has been pretty simple and pretty much the same. You focus on what we've done and you focus on a few heroes. And as Renan, the French theorist, said that a nation is a group of people who have agreed to remember the same things and forget the same things. The obvious example of the UK would be, of course, remembering the stand of the country in 1940, and other things get forgotten. And those memories are commemorated, are held and made public by the selection of heroes that children learn about at school, and which reinforce that sense of a nation. The big question, I think, is, can Europe do this? Is there a way for Europe to find an agreed story of what we did together, and agreed heroes that we can celebrate? The model of the nation state is familiar to all of us. The next slide, please. For the French, it's Louis XIV, triumphant, victorious, on a rearing horse, and reminding all French people of the moment when France totally dominated Europe militarily and could invade Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and Italy, and fight Spain more or less with impunity. Next slide, please. For the Russians, it's Suvorov, the man who conquered Ukraine and made it part of Russia in the late 18th century. Typically, interestingly, although the British, we have models, we also have monuments to military heroes, Wellington and many others. Interestingly, our horses tend to stand on all 4 feet rather than to rear. Quite puzzling, but interesting iconographic difference between them and us. But obviously, I didn't say no more about Ukraine, what that says, but for the French, Louis XIV is more difficult in a Europe. Can we have military heroes who conquered our neighbors, who are symbols of aggression? If not, there's another register in which we create our national heroes and our national identity. Next, please. And that, of course, is the rebel. When Switzerland decides in the early 19th century that it's going to turn itself from a loose grouping of cantons into something like a nation state, it needs heroes. And the hero it opts for, one you all know, is, of course, William Tell, who rebels against, who leads the fight against the Austrians, against Gessler, who is made to shoot the arrow off his son's head, and in many of the later versions of the legend, then takes the next bow from the crossbow and shoots Gessler himself. The hero fighting for national independence, not conquering others, but projecting and protecting the idea of the state. And this image, of course, gets taken up by Schiller, who writes his play about William Tell, and then goes European in the opera of Rossini. A myth, we don't really know anything about William Tell, and then literature, and then music, and then somehow it becomes an essential part of national identity. Next slide, please. And later in the century, turns into a statue. It's a pattern we can see across Europe. In the Scotland of my childhood, it was Robert Bruce and William Wallace who were heroized, mythologized, and then became statues. Sometimes they're the martyrs, the victims. Next slide, please. When Belgium, after 1830, decides it needs an emblem of what it stands for, who it's about, then you have the Counts of Horn and Counts of Egmont and Horn, who stood up against the Spaniards in the 16th century and are executed. You can see Egmont and Horn, the names written on the scaffold, and they become the heroes of a new kind of national identity. Goethe writes the play about Egmont. Beethoven writes the overture that you all know. And again, Europe realizes that Flanders, Belgium, has a hero, two heroes, in fact. Next slide, please. And they also turn into statues. It's a perfect form of nation building, nation making. It's the kind of myth that Europe, of course, doesn't have. It's the kind of myth that nations actually can no longer quite manage either, because with mass immigration, the arrival of new populations for whom these stories have much less resonance, the old idea of the single national hero or the nation fighting its neighbors has lost its power. And so the museums, the place where normally you set out your national history, have had to change and reflect that. Two immediately striking examples. Next slide, please. The Rijksmuseum, which is created in the middle of the 19th century in Amsterdam, after Belgium has become independent, was conceived as a monument to Dutchness. Rembrandt in the middle, like an altar, the Night Watch at the end of the main nave. No paintings virtually by anybody other than Dutch artists. A narrative of the Netherlands, the independent Netherlands. The new Rijksmuseum, which you see before you, recently opened, recently transformed, has had to rewrite that narrative very profoundly, not just to include the whole of Europe in the story, but above all to include a story of the Netherlands that embraces the non-European Dutch who are now citizens. And we see exactly the same, next slide please, in our own National Portrait Gallery, recently reopened, recently rethought. The purpose of the Portrait Gallery is, of course, to tell the story of Britain, of the United Kingdom, through great lives, through the lives of particular people. The new version has enormously expanded the number of people, the backgrounds of the people in the national story. We can't just have a story of the traditional British nation. It must include those people from outside who come recently to become British citizens. Our national story is rewritten here in a very striking way. And if you want one symbol of the way in which I think all European national stories are being rewritten and to embrace the wider world, which is now part of Europe, the great new acquisition on show in the National Portrait Gallery, next slide please, is Reynolds' portrait of Omai, the prince from Tahiti, from the Pacific, who visited Europe in the late 18th century, became a great celebrity, and stands in the Portrait Gallery for that moment when Europe became part of the whole of the rest of the world, both through exploration, through trade, through conquest. But the histories of Europe and the histories of the world intermixed and fused in a way that we can't separate today. The presence of this picture in our National Portrait Gallery tells us something very profound about how we're now reimagining ourselves and re-understanding ourselves through images, through a changing history of the people that we were. What does this mean for Europe? You can't have a conquering hero. you can't have a martyr hero. And it's very difficult to know where you begin. Next slide, please, because the man who really invented Europe, if you like, European community, those elements that turned into the European Union that we would again like to be part of, is Jean Monnet, the brilliant French politician, thinker, who conceived the Steel and Coal Union and who realized that after the Second World War, it was very, very important to achieve one thing, which was that Europe should not be what it had been. And he began trying to achieve that by putting together things that had never before been together, France and Germany sharing steel and coal, and trying to reimagine quite differently how a political entity might be. You can't imagine this man on a rearing horse. You can't imagine him as a public hero, remembered as a statue in a public square. We need to look elsewhere, I think, next slide, please, for how we find people, ideas, symbols for the community of Europe, of which we are still part, bigger than the European Union, evolving, growing, and in which we want to continue to play a part. And there, I think we have something very important to do, because how we talk about Europe, the stories we choose to tell, the people we choose to privilege in our narrative, and the institutions we choose to focus on, will, over time, shape, I think, the way all of us imagine this community. It was a question that was of critical importance to the Germans immediately after the war. And they were, of course, concerned with how Western Europe, coming out of that Monet dream, could reimagine itself. And they turned quite naturally to a moment over 1,000 years earlier, next slide please, when large parts of Western Europe had been united to the empire of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the West, the Western Roman Emperor, in the year 800 in Rome. And you can see that his empire covers pretty well exactly the original six of the European Union, with some tributary states to the right, but otherwise we're looking at the Europe of the six of 1958. In the year 1950, the citizens of Charlemagne's capital, you can see top right in the blue section, Aix-la-Chapelle, Aachen in Germany. That was Charlemagne's capital. It was the first city in Germany to be liberated by the Allies after the Nazi period. And next slide, please. In 1950, the citizens of Aachen, here is the cathedral of Charlemagne's cathedral, decided that they would institute a Charlemagne prize to celebrate the person who had done most to bring about the unity of Europe. It was an extraordinary idea, reviving an old historical fact, the Empire of Charlemagne, finding a hero and ritualizing the moment. Perfect example of how normally one creates an identity and loyalty to a political entity. And on this basis, they started the Charlemagne Prize, and Charlemagne, next slide please, became very quickly the symbol of Europe. Europe as conceived by the European Union in its early days, and has continued through the bestowal every year of the Charlemagne Prize. It's a very complicated and difficult choice. And what I want to look at, thinking about how difficult it'll be or how we might think of finding something for the future, is why it turned out, what seemed like a brilliant idea has turned out not to be so brilliant. Because Charlemagne, who was thought in the 1950s to be a great unifying figure of Europe, became and has become ever more divisive and ever more difficult. Next slide, please. The crown of Charlemagne, seen here, and this is what was historically known as the crown of Charlemagne, now in Vienna, is, as you can see, a very Christian crown, because Charlemagne was a Christian emperor. And not just a Christian emperor, he's a militant Christian imperialist. Charlemagne, the emperor, is always at war, and he's at war against Islam on the west in Spain, and he's at war against the Slavs and the pagans on the east, the Saxons and the Slavs. This is a very complicated hero to choose for an EU that had expanded and wanted to embrace both Spain and the east of Europe, but also that had a population that was growingly Muslim. In Charlemagne's time, the Islamic other, next slide please, was of course Islam. This is a deliberately anachronistic image of Istanbul, the other great Roman capital, the capital of the other Roman emperor, the Turkish emperor, already in 800, but with the Christian emperor, and of course later the capital of Muslim Turkey, seen all through the 17th century as the other that Europe had to defend itself against, the siege of Vienna, whatever, and still seen by many as a threat to Europe. But a demonstration that whatever else we're looking for, this aspect of Charlemagne's inheritance can't possibly be taken on. The Christian Europe of Charlemagne has to be abandoned, and with it, its anti-Muslim rhetoric. But there's another side that doesn't work either. Next slide, please. Charlemagne became the model for every ruler who wanted to conquer the whole of Europe. He was a military model. When you're seeing this at home, you're looking at the David portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps. What I fear you may not be able to see at the bottom of the image, you'll see the name Bonaparte written firmly in the snow of the Alps as Bonaparte set off on the conquest of Europe. What you can't see is that below that is another zone saying Carolus Magnus, Charlemagne. And when Napoleon becomes emperor, he takes over many of the elements, the symbols of Charlemagne. Charlemagne as a military model for European conquest becomes the dominant idea of the 19th century, and it survives in the 20th century. Next slide, please. Here is a Sèvres plate with on it an image of Charlemagne, very well known in the Middle Ages, again on horseback, riding out with his sword to attack the Muslims in the West, the enemy in the West, and the enemy on the East. This is produced in the 1940s in Paris, and it's produced, if you turn the plate over, next slide please, as you can see, on the orders of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler defends the empire of Charlemagne, which had been divided by his grandsons, his descendants. Adolf Hitler defends it with all the people of Europe in 1943. You can see why, next slide please, Charlemagne is dangerous. You can see why Charlemagne became totally unusable as a full symbol of what Europe could be. And that's part of the problem we're going to have, I think, with Europe, to find symbols that can endure, that really can run across the whole of our continent, where there's some element of history, but some element also of hope for the future that everyone can engage with. The Charlemagne Prize goes on and is awarded every year to various people who have worked for, as you can see here, die Einheit Europas, the unity of Europe. And it has been awarded in recent years to Angela Merkel in 2008 and to Emmanuel Macron in 2018, 10 years later, when she made the speech in his honor. And in between, in 2017, it was awarded to Timothy Garton Ash, the great British European, all those who worked for the unity of Europe. If Charlemagne is no longer the symbol, this moment is an opportunity for people to talk about what they see Europe as being. And the next slide, please. There, the differences are very striking indeed. Another person who's been awarded the prize, as you can see, is Pope Francis. A Christian Europe, we've agreed, I think, can no longer be a defining identity for the continent. Merkel in 2008 was very clear. She said that Europe, for her, the point of Europe is about preserving human rights. Für uns steht der Mensch im Mittelpunkt. For us, the human being, the individual citizen, is in the middle. And everything to defend the dignity and the freedom of the individual is, she said, what will give us a compass in all our dealings in politics and society. It's a clear articulation of an ideal that she hoped would build a European house that would be robust and hospitable. It's an idea I want to come back to. Macron in 2018 proposed a very different idea indeed. He talked about Europe being the dream of Charlemagne, going right back to Charlemagne, of a unity that was willed and une concorde conquise sur les différences, conquered over differences. It's a word Macron uses a lot, conquête, conquise, an almost military idea of a unity over diversity. He talked about the sovereignty of Europe, and strikingly, given that this was 2018 and Europe had already expanded so far to the east, he talked about a Europe united in its beating heart, which is this region, the Rhineland, the Franco-German border, a vision of Europe which certainly strikes me as strikingly out of date and very unlikely to appeal to the half of the continent to the east of Aachen. Timothy Garton Ash took a different line. He pointed out that Charlemagne was the first emperor of what became the Holy Roman Empire, that extraordinary assemblage of states, each independent, in the middle of Europe, that lasted, as he pointed out, from Charlemagne for 1,000 years. Next slide, please. This is the Holy Roman Empire. It's largely modern Germany, but with Belgium, as you can see, Austria, Netherlands on the left, and large parts of what later became now Poland, and parts of Austria and Bohemia, and North Italy. This extraordinary grouping of states that were independent, autonomous, many with their own currency, all with the different laws, were held together in an agreement that they would somehow work together, that they would, particularly after the wars of religion had subsided from the late 17th century, work together, and they did. They met, they discussed, they sorted out a lot of trade problems, they sorted out a lot of legal problems, and they held together in a spirit of respectful disagreement. What Garton Ash describes as an empire that functioned by accepting disagreement and disgruntlement as permanent elements of its European politics. That seems to me a pretty good model for a European polity. Disagreement and disgruntlement accepted as at the heart, a framework that allows it to be held together, and at the center point, as Merkel observed, human dignity and human freedoms. That, I think, is a very clear statement of an aim. But what is that enough? Can holding out the aim be enough? When Monnet dreamt of the European Union, he was, of a European community, what he was really driven by was not the future in that sense, but by the past. If most polities are put together by the hostility against the other, it's been very strikingly and well observed that Europe's other is its own past. The key driver for Monet was never again. Europe must never be what it was. This is, I think, a radically new approach to how you build a community, build a political entity. Not just what you want it to be, but above all, by keeping remembering what you were and what you don't want to be again. I think we're now again at a moment where that dynamic, that energy that comes from not wanting to be what we were, can be reharnessed. And it's something in which the UK and the whole of Europe can share, because in a sense, next slide please, we're already sharing it. The great political development, it seems to me, of the last few years in Western Europe, and not just Western Europe, across Europe, if we leave aside the war in Ukraine, has been the revulsion across the whole continent against racism and against systemic inequality and historic exploitation. You all know this image of the Colston statue being felled in Bristol. You all know that similar events took place across the whole of Europe. Different targets, but always the same demand, and a demand especially strongly held by the young, articulated in the street, in the public place, and in politics. A need to change our symbols to show that we will never again be what we were, that we want to change our society. We want to make our society a place where human dignity is in the center, where that will be the guiding principle for political and social actions, and where that can, I think, become something that we use as the basis for the Europe of the future, just as it was used as the basis of the Europe in 1945 and 1950s. And I want to finish this point by pointing out that this has already been done. If there is one country in Europe that has reshaped itself, remade itself in our lifetimes, it is, of course, the Federal Republic of Germany. And the great driver of that has been constantly erecting in the public square, constantly discussing what Germany does not want to be again. The fact that beside the Bundestag in Berlin is the monument to the Holocaust is the clearest imaginable statement of a country using the past it rejects as the energy to become and to build the future that it wants. That, I think, is a model that Germany has evolved, that others can follow. And one of the places we can do it is in the museum. I want to look briefly at the museum in Berlin. Next slide, please. The museum in Spandau, just in the outskirts of Berlin, this medieval fortress. And in it, next slide, please, are gathered together the monuments that used to be exhibited in central Berlin, which represent views of the world, ways of behaving, views of the human being, which are no longer acceptable. Here you see some of the statues of the great figures of Prussia, particularly the militaristic figures, particularly the figures who believed in military aggression, taken off their pedestals, shown as they were damaged by bombs, put almost on the floor, so that the visitor can see this is what once people like us thought, this is what we will no longer be. As you walk through this museum, it's a striking reminder of the power of looking at what our parents, grandparents thought and what we no longer want to believe. Next slide, please. In the rooms after this, you have this, a church bell. A church bell, as you can see, dated 1934, and a church bell marked with the swastika. A reminder of the total failure of a society at every moral level. A reminder of the society we refuse to become, but did and could become. But this will, it is hoped, keep us properly focused. And finally, next slide, please. Monumental head of Lenin, part of a huge statue in East Berlin, another symbol of a view of tyranny of contempt of the human being, from which we have turned away, here to remind us that we cannot be this, and that remembering what we do not want to be and insisting that we are going to make a different world has produced in Germany a state like no other in Europe. But I think there's a model here for all of Europe and for all of us. The young particularly, I think, join in this view, whether they're talking about climate change or other forms of politics, of exploitation, of racism. They know what they don't want the future to be. And that is an enormous dynamic and energetic force that we can harness. We have to talk about that. We have to talk less about the moments in our past which divide, and focus on these elements which we all share somewhere in our history, these black moments that across Europe we no longer will tolerate. What can we talk about positively? And how do you institutionalize this? I think strikingly, there are a number of institutions that already do this, that show how we collaborate together, what we can do together, and what can be achieved only by doing it together. And I want to start with, next please, perhaps the silliest, but also perhaps the oldest, the Eurovision Song Contest. This is an extraordinary moment when the continent as a whole celebrates fun, silliness, creativity, talent. And we've evolved together a way of making it ridiculous, but also making it serious, also making it something that the whole of Europe can enjoy and share together. It's a very important building block. And it's no accident that last year, of course, the winner, without any question, and I suspect without particular regard to artistic merit, was Ukraine, a statement that the whole of Europe was united in thinking about its support for Ukraine. But there are other more serious areas of Europe that we can talk about, can heroize, and can start, I think, thinking about. Next slide, please. Erasmus, we all know, the great scholar of Rotterdam, the great man who believed in a frontierless world of knowledge and of tolerance and of exchange of ideas. The man who stands behind the Erasmus program that once allowed students to move across Europe, and which we hope one day British students might once again be able to be part of. The Erasmus program, what Erasmus stands for, and above all now Horizon. What Europe can do together in Horizon, we all know, is absolutely central, and why we have to be part of it. And I think it's important that we talk about these more and more, because it's in talking about these things repeatedly, boringly, that we slowly change the way I think other citizens think about what Europe can be, Europe together. And to go back to the most central part of Merkel's view, next slide, please, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, not a creation of the European Union, as we know, but absolutely central to what Europe wants to be, and above all, what Europe does not want to be. Here is an institution that we ought, I think, to be talking about much more, praising much more highly, insisting that this is part of the Europe we want to be, because it is part of the Europe that is that is a rejection of a past as much of a proclamation of the future. And finally, last slide, please. CERN, the European Centre for Nuclear Research. Here is surely the supreme example of what we can do as a continent together, as people working together to tackle global problems, to tackle the questions that we need to address for the future. And in the middle, extraordinarily, a statue of the Indian god Shiva, the god of creation and destruction, dancing in the fire, the god of rejection of what is past, the destruction of what is past, in order to make something new. That out of that destruction, out of that rejection comes something new and something positive. And that, I think, is something we can internalize through this kind of image, through that kind of conversation, but also something we can show in our museums and our galleries. We can show what Europe can do together. Walking through the National Gallery in London is the perfect demonstration of what a continent, by exchange, competition, collaboration, can create for the whole world. It's exactly the same in every other area of our lives. And I think if we can start talking in that way, harnessing the idealism that we've seen so manifested in the last few years towards rejecting the past, and on that rejection, building a Europe worthy of the great ideals of the immediate post-war world. Thank you.
Well, Neil, that was an astonishing talk. The breadth and the depth of it, covering vast areas of territory, covering vast areas of history, and looking in depth and across politics and historical thought and philosophy and religion, was really the most breathtaking presentation. Thank you very, very much indeed. You've of course overrun a bit, but I think in all the circumstances, I more than forgive you for that. Neil, it was really wonderful. For the next few minutes, Neil and I would just have a discussion about one or two aspects of that before we have the question and answer session. It may be that we want to go on a little bit beyond 7:30, but at the moment, I think we better aim towards that end. Neil, could I talk to you a bit or question you a bit more on the subject of myths? Because I think what underlies your concept of unity, whether it's nation states or whether it's Europe, is the idea of something far more than the practicalities. It's about myths and symbols. And you're really suggesting that despite all the evidence in the past about myths emerging from very positive activities, that it's possible for myths to emerge built on avoidance, rejection, dismantling things that had happened in the past, and combined, of course, with aspirations for the future. But that really is a change, isn't it? Because myths historically have been built on positives, and they've been built on memories, i.e. something that's happened in the past, rather than aspirations, things one looking to the future. So do you really think it's credible that one can build myths on the basis of the future?
Yes, I do actually. Because I think I think that is really what the whole creation of the European Union was about. It was a rejection, a determination not to be anything else. It's also, I think, the basis of all the great and enduring religious movements are about rejecting something and turning to a different way of doing things. These are, I think it is possible. Politically, I don't think it, I suppose the equivalent would be some kinds of iconoclasm, some kind of revolutions. The revolutions are about rejecting the past. The great moments, the dynamic of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, very clearly, they're about rejections of the past. And on that rejection, you move towards something which in the case of France turned out to be far more equal, far more appealing to the greater part of its people. So I think the idea of building on rejection is absolutely possible. It's not the traditional foundation myth at all. But of course, Europe is not like anything else. And this, I think, is the point. One of the challenges of this is that if you think the nation myths of Europe are of the sort that I briefly described, the nation myths of the United States, for instance, which was a supranational community, was about ideas of manifest destiny, endless expansion to the West. That's not open. So in a sense, I think this is the only kind of mythic language that Europe can have. But I also think it's a very powerful one. And we've seen just how strong that sense of rejection is, I think, in the last few years. I think it's really worth pondering the power of those attacks on the symbols of racism and colonialism and injustice over the last 2 or 3 years. They were across the whole continent, and they were led by the young. It must be possible to capitalize on that and build on that.
There's a myth normally take, I mean, I'm thinking in the past again, I think of myth as something that builds up over generations and generations. It takes a very long time to create a nation because those myths need so much time to take seed, take root. Do you believe that the sort of myths that you're now advocating for Europe can take effect sort of in the short term, or are we inevitably in for a very, very long haul?
I think we're clearly in for a very long haul because for a strong European myth to take hold that can rival the nation state, there's a lot of work to be done. I think it's interesting that everywhere the narrative myth, the historic myth of the nation state in Western Europe, across Europe, not just Western Europe, is in question and is in some measure being dismantled. That's a great opportunity. It's very clear that the received national myths no longer work for a very significant part of the population. They can't hold the population. That is a very good moment for us to be trying to talk about a supranational myth, because the myths are in trouble.
And do you think that that sort of new type of myth can have validity and have power relatively quickly?
Well, I think we imagine how you read the movement against the imagery of slavery and of imperial domination, but that moved astonishingly fast. I mean, there had been a lot of building work before. The academic work had been done, if you like. A lot of the political groundwork had been laid, but it suddenly became a popular public movement with real energy very fast. And that's why I think if we build the other positive myths of the achievement of Europe in the cultural area, in human rights, in science, then there's a solid positive base to stand on as well. And it all goes part of it, how you change the conversation. I think the way you make a myth is by people talking about things in a certain way again and again. I mean, if you're at the myth of 1940 and the UK is because it's been told again and again, and in a shifting way. The focus on alone in 1940, which has been repeated again and again, slowly forgot the fact that alone meant with the empire that included a quarter of the world's population. The narrative shifted because it was repeated again and again with a different emphasis. Yeah. That's how myths happen. And we make the myths if we talk about the state, the community in a certain way, and keep talking about it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're implying in all this that the emergence of a new myth, such as you're talking about, I mean, it must go hand in hand with the sort of dumping of the old myths.
Yes, absolutely.
It is a two-way process, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It is. That's perhaps why it is so difficult, because it's about getting people not just to subscribe to new concepts and ideas, but also to dump over nationalistic, if you like, or out of date previous myths.
I think that's right, and but I think that's why this is a good moment to be addressing this, because the optimistic reading would be that there's a very strong movement, particularly among the younger population, towards rejecting the received nationalist myths with which we grew up, the received view of Europe in the world with which we grew up. That is changing very fast. The national myths have less and less traction with the younger population. So that process is already underway because they don't talk about the country in those terms. In almost any country in Europe, that is the case. So, and it's a question of how we talk about it. and how we talk differently about the past and about the future.
There's just a question also in my mind, though, about whether the concept of a myth, perhaps it's the wrong word nowadays, is really conceivable and credible in the age of social media. I mean, where everybody is communicating individual views, almost every subject under the sun, and at enormous speed, compared and contrasted with the way that convention, if you like, myths grew up over generations, with a very slow communication systems and transfers. So is it really believable that something as substantial as a myth can come into being in an age of social media?
I don't know. Yeah, that really is a question for a social anthropologist. But I would think yes, because of course what really helps the myth is when the leader articulates it, and we haven't had very many. Beyond Chancellor Merkel, we've had very few major political figures who have articulated a view of Europe as a community that would win assent, I think, from one end of the continent to the other. That, of course, is what helps. But once you have leaders that do it, then I think this can move very fast. We've seen in the US, there's a mythology about the last elections in the US that has certainly moved very fast and become a myth in the age of social media.
Yes. My final question on myths is really as to whether you think it's possible for new myths to emerge. Well, rather, did old myths emerge really because there was no verifiable shared reality? There was religious beliefs, there was, let's say again, very slow communications between people, and there was no external measure or sort of reality check to really argue against the myth. Whilst nowadays, of course, we see reality everywhere, however much it may be defamed or misrepresented. So, I mean, it brings me to a sort of slightly linked question: is, do you think that reality, the fact that one can get hard facts which apply, not quite universally, but very substantially, could be a new unifying force in place of the concept of a myth?
To go back to take the first part of that, myths are very resilient in the face of reality. If you take in the case of France, I mean, the fact that France went on believing in the myth of Louis XIV and Napoleon as the embodiment of what France ought to be, although both ended in bitter defeat. And the reality made it quite clear that they were not what they were held up to be. I don't think that's so I think they can resist reality, to go back to your first point. And what we're really talking about is a story that people tell themselves. I mean, that's what we mean by myth, isn't it? What does the community tell itself about what it was and what it wants to be? And that's what you can change. And they both have very complex relations to reality, because they're selections of reality on one hand and an attempt to shape reality on the other. But it's what humans have always done and have to do if a community is to survive. It needs to keep changing the story of what it was and re-articulating the story of what it wants to be. We need a very dramatic shift, I think, in both those. And we need to try to bring that about to make a European community.
I mean, on a good day, I wake up in the morning thinking that, well, to use a legal expression that you and I as former lawyers are aware of res ipsa loquitur, that the facts speak for themselves. And we've been seeing so much of that in this country over the last year or two, that we've been seeing undeniable adverse consequences of Brexit in almost every area. I mean, whether it's been to do with the economy, education, science, defense, or whatever. And that on a good day, it seems to me that that reality must prevail, and that we should be confident that we are going to return to the heartland of Europe, because actually that is what is best for us, and that's what's best for Europe as well, and probably best for the world as well. So what do you say to that? That is the existence of, or the greater availability of real facts, and daily produced by newspapers or by thinkers or think tanks or whatever, a help or a hindrance in achieving our goals? I want for the moment to set aside questions of fake news. And fake news seems to me to be one of the great sins, crimes of our time, something that is actually distorting reality. But setting that aside for a moment, is reality something that we should be confident will help us towards getting back to where we should be?
Oh, yes, I think absolutely. It's again about making clear the past that we as a country want to reject. The evidence about why Brexit has been so damaging in so many ways is something that clearly is already has led to a large number of our fellow citizens changing their mind. And this is very good news for us all. I mean, the more those facts are repeated, the stronger the argument to reject that and move towards something else. Which is why I feel that what we also ought to be talking about is the great achievements of Europe, not in the obvious, not only in the obvious economic sense, and leaving aside the defense areas, but in all the other areas like human rights, like scientific research, which of course I know the European movement is doing steadily, but which we must all, I think, try to encourage more and more people to do more and more, and to make it part of the constant public discourse that with our European partners, we can do things that otherwise are completely impossible, and that are good things to do.
And so the other side of that coin is that reality and facts, as you said earlier in your talk, don't do it all. There's got to be an emotional content. There's got to be something that brings people together emotionally to create a political entity. And I think in your mind, if I read you properly, the concept really of the noble cause, the fact that the pooling of sovereignty, which is of course the heart of what the EU is all about, is a noble cause. It is for the common good, a limited pooling of sovereignty, and that there's got to be, I think, a belief in that and an emotional commitment to that, an aspiration to those sort of virtues to go alongside these more pragmatic realities. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And again, that's why I think that we've just had a wonderful demonstration of that. I think in the way that the President Michel has said that the EU would like to think of embracing Ukraine as a full member as soon as possible. And we all know what that represents economically and politically. I mean, it's a statement of exactly the sort of the defense of democracy, of the defense of human values, of resisting aggression, and all the things that we believe the European Union should stand for are in that statement. And that is, I think, the kind of statement, the kind of aim that will generate an emotional engagement. As we've seen, the enormous emotional engagement of the last few years, in the cause of fighting for justice against racism and whatever. I mean, that can, I'm sure, be harnessed towards that notion of a Europe that will defend and protect and those rights, those aspirations to freedom and to human freedoms, more important than economic, perhaps, in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. There is an articulation of an ideal. It needs a more powerful orator than we have at the moment, the leaders need to articulate these more strongly. But I'm sure it's possible.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's possible.
My final issue I'd just like to raise with you is the question about Europe's relationship with the rest of the world, which you didn't really talk particularly about that, as Europe as a bloc and its relations with the rest of the world, and whether the sort of myth is necessarily inward-looking, and there's a danger of Europe treating the rest of the world as the other. And I think one issue in particular strikes me as one of migration, where that seems to me, above all, the European issue, that it looks like it's a long-term, possibly perpetual human tide flowing towards Europe, and should put on an absolute call for European unity in the way in which it responds to the rest of the world.
Yes, I think this is surely one of the places where that refusal to be what we were in the past is a very powerful argument. We all know how every country in Europe behaved in the 1930s, confronted with people needing political asylum, with the Jewish refugees, and the failure of pretty well every country in Europe and beyond. There is surely the great example of why not wanting to be what we were points the way to the future. This is not opening the doors necessarily to, or this doesn't affect economic migration, but it does reflect absolutely the question of asylum. And there, again, we need, I think, a very clear call to the European values of protecting people threatened in that way. So I think there's a strong, very strong argument there for focusing on what Europe did not do and what it must do, particularly in areas where European actors have themselves been responsible for the wars and the regimes from which people are now seeking political asylum.
Right. Thank you, Neil, very much. Right, it's time now, I think, to pass to others to ask you questions or ask us questions. I think probably you questions. And I'm going to go to my colleague, Michael, who I think is going to come on, Michael Anderson, will come on screen, and he will handle those questions. Michael, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me, Richard?
Yep, I can, very well.
Excellent. I've been advised by Scott to leave my video off just to not disrupt the spotlight situation. We've got lots of questions. Thank you for sending them in, everyone. We're going to start with a question from Miriam Leonard, and Scott is going to invite her up to the screen to ask her question.
Just a bit of housekeeping on that note, as when we invite you onto screen, it may look like you're disappearing from the event because Zoom just has to reset. So it'll take a few seconds to bring you back on screen, and then you'll appear back into the event. So Miriam, I'm going to invite you to come onto screen now. Just takes a few seconds to come through, just bear with us.
Video? Yeah. Oh, start video.
I think Miriam's there now, yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you. If you don't want to be on screen, we can definitely still hear you.
I'm here. It's not actually Miriam. It's James. I'm her husband. It was my question, which was that the values that you give as being fundamental to Europe, to the concept of Europe, are in fact international. So how can you reconcile them with a Europe which is defined by borders?
Thank you. Well, I don't think some of them are universal, as articulated in Europe, but I don't think they are defined by borders. What we're talking about is a European Union that actually lives and enacts these values. There are very few places in the world that fully do. We would be delighted, I think, if other polities, other communities do the same. But the purpose is not, I think, to say that this is unique to Europe. It is that Europe has a unique chance to make this the center of what it does and how it defines what holds it together. There are many different ways, for instance, in terms of democracy, of how one would manage disagreement without violence, which may not be the European model, and the same in other areas. But I think the fact that Europe wants to work with it, we want to build a community of neighbors doing the same thing, holding the same beliefs. That's what I think we're talking about. I don't think it's anything other than very desirable if the rest of the world chooses to do the same, insofar as it can build some kind of political union. We have the chance of a political union or political community with Europe that we don't have elsewhere. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Partly, but there is the thing that the concept of Europe that you have is defined by a border, that in this border, you're in Europe, outside that border, you're out of Europe. And yet the values that we want to promote are shared, I would say, by a lot of countries outside Europe.
Yes, I would agree with that. But we're talking about the area, the countries that we can control, where we have a political community that can make decisions and can act together. And the boundary is not one of being in or out, beyond the sense that the territories that have articulated the shared views, particularly if we go to Eastern Europe, then there's a clear point at which, beyond which, the European Union can't act. So I think it's an expandable unity, clearly, but I don't think that it matters that there are places like, let's say, Australia or the United States or Canada that share those views but are elsewhere and will not be part of the same political unity.
I think we should probably move on to the next question now, Neil. Thank you very much.
For the next question, we're going to go to Louise Vale.
Louise, I think we can hear you now.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry, I've lost, oh, here you are again. I lost you temporarily. My question is quite long, but the climate crisis is coming upon us, and it seems likely to have an impact comparable to another major war on Europe. And so I wondered if there was anything you'd like to say about it in terms of the opportunities that creates for cooperation, because clearly we share geography and weather patterns, and we share technology and research. But there's also the risk that it may reinforce nationalistic thinking and countries wanting to protect their borders in some ways and protect their countries. For example, if there's going to be large-scale migration from the south to the north.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think the climate crisis is a very good example of what we're talking about, I think, isn't it, is where we can argue that together with our partners in Europe, we can do far more than we can on our own. That's the conversation we're trying to generalize and spread to a wider world, and a wider public here. And the climate crisis seems to be a very good model for that, because we know we have huge support among particularly among the younger population, for international action. As you say, only by international action can we hope to make any difference at all. And we can start with the European neighbours because they're closest, but also because we have this possibility of closer political connection. And there you do have a very strong emotional base to build on, and to campaign for Europe-wide climate initiatives seems to me to be a very powerful thing for the European Union movement to do, an important thing to do. It's an area where it seems to me there's no argument against, and it's possible to work closely with our European neighbours in this area. And again, as always, to show why the nation state, the interest of the nation state, may need to be set aside.
Thank you. Yes.
Michael, should we move on now?
Yep. Next question is from Stefan Hounslow.
I think we can hear you, Stephen, if you're there. Yes, there you are. Yeah. You may be on mute, actually. We can see you, but not hear you.
Thank you, Neil, for that very erudite talk. We all know the sort of political holy grail of pro-Europeans is to find a slogan with the political brilliance of take back control. And how do pro-Europeans translate all these complex thoughts you have into something much more simple and emotionally engaging, given that a lot of people won't engage with the history in the way that you have and we are?
Well, this is where we need a political leader, isn't it? And we need a political leader across Europe. It's if we're talking about the UK, then obviously it does need a leader committed who can find the words. And the slogan has to be something along the lines, in the sense of the Obama words, something like "Together we can," or something of that sort. And what we can do together, it has to be about that. The sort of language that was used in the Scottish referendum by those who wanted to keep the union. But I'd have thought a key challenge is to find those words that really can, as you say, sum up that ambition and energize people, because it needs that. But I think that comes on top of building the understanding in all the other areas as much as we can. But that's the mark of that's the communications team. We need to work now, I think, on those slogans.
And certainly people like Keir Starmer, who's going to have to make a big speech on Europe at some point, are going to be decisive in how they frame that. And it seems to me that that's really the practical politics of this. Or how do we find simple messages that engage people in a positive way about Europe, rather than seeing it purely as a sort of something, an economic. It needs a positive social message, which plays into what you're saying, but we just need to sort of express it in a simpler way.
I think you're right. I mean, it has to be. I mean, in Europe, in UK policy, it has to be something of the sort like "the closer, the better," something like that, that can be used again and again. That whether we're talking about climate or scientific research or human rights, the closer, the better. It's got to be something like that. We can move from one area to the other. And I think you're absolutely right. Starmer's going to have to say something about this. The Tory party will have to, once we've got to a new parliament, and the other parties will also have a view. But it would be good to find some kind of pro-European language that could be adopted by all the different parties, showing the same benefit in the different areas you say that have to be addressed. It was missed very badly in the pandemic. I mean, very strikingly, there was a chance to show what could have been done in coordination. But no, you're absolutely right. That kind of rallying language is what we need from a political leader, showing the benefits in the different areas.
It's certainly also true.
We ought to move on now to another question, because there's quite a few waiting and there's not very much time. But thanks very much, Neil.
Thanks, Stefan.
Who's next, Michael?
Thank you, Stefan. Next, we've got Molly Scott-Cato.
Hi, Molly. Hi there, Molly. We can see you now. Yeah.
Hi, Molly. It looks like you're still muted.
Yeah, it's okay.
Oh,
I've unmuted now. Sorry, I'm slightly in the dark, but I've got my correct flag, so that's good. Let me say at the beginning how what a brilliant lecture that was, and how very much I enjoyed it. And I think it's exactly the sort of thinking we need to be doing. So thank you very much, Neil, and thank you, Richard, for inviting Neil to come along. I just want to say before I ask my question that I'm totally with Neil over the myths, and myths over facts every time when you're making political decisions. They're much more powerful. And I think social media actually enables myths to spread much more quickly. And I think we saw that with Take Back Control, as indeed you said, Neil, with the myths around the election being stolen and so on. Maybe that's easier with negative myths than positive ones, but I'll try to be upbeat. Anyway, my point is, or something I wanted to suggest to you, when you got to the end, I really thought you were going to take us to the Parliamentarium, which is a particularly incredible thing just outside the European Parliament, because it's actually a museum celebrating democracy. And obviously I'm a bit of a democracy nut myself, but I had to stop taking guests there because I always was reduced to tears within a few sort of, meters of going inside there. And I got so embarrassed I didn't take people there anymore. But it's a very powerful celebration of a key European value, which is that the people should decide. And even though democracy is not working very well, the myth that is represented in the parliamentarium is very powerful. So I would add that to your list. And I also wanted to throw in the idea of Jan Kamensky as a really central European in terms of knowledge and education and so many good values. Although having said all these things, I'm slightly aware of the fact that I'm being a bit of a sort of very upper middle class white person, and maybe that's not so helpful. So maybe we also need to think a little bit about social realism and some of those Soviet style sculptures of ordinary people. Can ordinary people become mythical? I'm not really sure. Anyway, yeah, I'm just throwing a few ideas at you really, but thank you so much appreciated, and really useful thinking to start us on our way.
Thank you, Molly. Yes, I mean, first of all, the idea of the Parliament as in a sense a hero of European history is something that could very much be developed. And one of the great advantages of Parliament, as it's now understood right across the EU, is of course an English invention. I mean, it's the English notion of a Parliament that conquers the continent, if you like, and shapes the continent. And there's something very powerful. I think it's a very, very clever suggestion. I mean, the Parliament as a hero across Europe, as the institution that changed Europe, and through which all of Europe has ultimately come to realize that this is how we want to manage the idea of the people in control. That's not a universal value. There are other ways of doing it, but it's the European model, certainly not the US one, and so on. So I think it's a very clever one, and something that really does. I mean, we can mythologize our Parliament as the European hero, and of course, individual people. There are here and there are of course statues that become emblematic of a particular struggle, a particular set of values, and the question will be again which one across the whole continent could stand for that. But these are the questions I think we need to be addressing, trying to think who could be elevated to that status and would be acceptable, credible, powerful, inspiring across the continent. Thank you. But Parliament, I think, absolutely. We have to start heroizing institutions as well as individuals.
And maybe climate heroes and sort of slightly anonymous general characters like that.
I think that exactly that.
We're coming a bit close to the end of our time. I don't know, Neil, would you be willing to do another 10 minutes, or is that
absolutely. If people have stamina.
I think there are. I can see in the chat there are some more questions.
Right.
Well, should we just agree that we'll do another 10 minutes of questions, but then I think we will draw it to an end then. So, Michael, back to you for the next questioner.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks for that question, Molly. Lots of good questions coming in. And yeah, sorry that we can't speak to each of them, just purely time restraints. For the next question, let's go to Leo Capella.
Hello, Leo. I think we can We hear you.
Hello, yes, you can hear me now. I'm going to keep my videos. In fact, I am a bit of a vampire at the moment because of excessive heat, so I'll keep my camera switched off if that's okay with people.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
My question is, what sort of hero do you think, or team of heroes, represent the European and motto of unity and diversity? For instance, like the European Space Agency.
Thank you. That's again, it's a really key question. You mentioned again one of those bodies that I think we should be talking about much more: the European Space Agency, Euratom, whatever. These are the bodies that I think we need to be turning. They are the heroes in what they're doing, and we want to be part of them. But we need to speak about them. And this is where what Molly was saying about social media is perhaps so important, that even if mainline press and the controlled media are not willing to give a great deal of time to these, social media can. And I think the Space Agency is a perfect example. I mean, what is being done through that, the explorations of outer space through that appeal to a very wide public. They are something that Europe can do because we can do it together, and none of us could do it on our own. And it's part of that pushing for a better together, closer the better argument in all kinds of areas of our life, to build that myth of Europe together can do what no individual country can do. And the heroes, I think, have to be, at the moment, the institutions, as you suggest. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, Michael. Yeah.
Next, let's go to Peter Burt.
Hi, Peter. You there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
we can. Yes, we can.
Fantastic, yeah. So thank you very much, Neil, for a fantastic presentation. My question really is to do with UK's role in Europe. And all of us, I think, in the European movement are in agreement that the UK's place is at the very heart of the European Union. And getting that message out, we need to use evidence based on history and what has led us to where we are now. And I'm looking for your help in what we can say that will most convincingly persuade people who doubt our case about that.
Well, it's quite it's a key question. Of course, we all agree the same thing, and we're all trying to get to the same point. The idea, I think, of trying to build a pantheon of great British Europeans is a very it's a very good one, a very, very good one. It's, I mean, obviously we could. The problem is that so many of the great ones who did contribute, then someone like Churchill, who would be an obvious figure, then kind of stood back. But I think in political terms, I have no immediate answers. In cultural terms, of course, the number one could talk about for the past. I mean, the role of, but this is at a higher level. I mean, the role of Shakespeare across Europe is absolutely enormous. Every European country has had their literature shaped by Shakespeare. I mean, without Shakespeare, it's all different. Whether one could look at those kinds of popular music, I'm afraid, would be the obvious thing. I mean, I think if we really want to talk about Europe as shaping a generation of the UK as shaping a generation of Europe, we should be focusing on popular music, and we should talk about popular music in that way. We don't, partly because it's also global, but we're interested at this point in the role of the UK in Europe. And there's no doubt that UK popular music has played and does play something absolutely central. And that is something that I think should be developed. So it's not really an answer to your question, but you've identified, I think, the problem. And the point of this conversation, I think, is really just to start thinking how we move forward in these different areas. But thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peter. I think we've got time for just 2 more questions. So, Michael, back to you. Yeah.
Great. Next, let's go to Magdalena Williams. Hi, Magdalena.
Hi. My question was regarding UK education, the curriculum and so forth, because during the referendum, we were very aware of the fact that people knew very little about Europe. And also when statues were being taken down, etc., there was a lot of outcry about, changing history and changing the way we see history. How can we make sure that the education system mirrors this view about European unity and how important it is for our country?
Thank you, Magdalena. This is, of course, really where it all has to keep coming back to, because what people are taught at school is, we know something that we all know from our own experience. It shapes it forever, and we can change it, we can get over it, we can put it aside, but we've got to, it's there. And thinking about the curriculum and how the curriculum is presented in terms of national history is a key one. There is, I think, already something quite positive there, and that is that one of the defects for many in the history curriculum is the overwhelming focus on the 20th century, much more than on any previous period, on both world wars and on the Holocaust. And there, out of that, is surely a narrative about Britain's central role in European history, but above all, in making the kind of Europe that we now want. It may take us back to Peter's question about the heroes. But I think that looking at that curriculum and the role that Britain played in preventing Europe from becoming the kind of barbarous place that it was in danger of becoming, but also in building the Europe and the European institutions that we have. There, I think the curriculum is central. What it means, I'm afraid, is again a lot of political campaigning with the Ministry of Education, with schools, about how that curriculum is presented, to include and focus on Britain's role in those, particularly in the Second World War. There's a very, very positive thing there, I think, to build on.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Magdalena. Yeah. And I think a final question, is it from Chris Hammond?
Yep. Last question, but certainly not least. Let's go to Chris Hammond.
Okay.
Hi there, Chris.
Hello. I've lost my questions because I, in fact, asked. Oh dear! Start my video.
I think I can read out your question, Chris, if you like.
Okay, read the run. I asked 3.
Actually, you asked 3. Well, I got question 2 here. It said that at the start of your talk, you made the point that we draw on the past to illuminate the present as a means of imagining the future. Should we therefore deny the importance of calibre grossa? You clean bowled me there, Chris, but I thought
Thank you, Chris. I very much admire your halo of European stars.
I was going to put Rotenborg in the back.
Yeah, and thank you also for rescuing Charlemagne from the French takeover and reminding us that he's also Karl der Große, Charles the Great. And I took him because I wanted to, partly because he was for 20 years so much the basic symbol and hero that was referred to. And I wanted to show how that symbol went wrong and why it wasn't an adequate one. But I think he could, in a sense, be an anti-hero. I mean, he is exactly what we don't want. We don't want a Europe that is fighting enemies on East and West, that is trying to construct others outside, and that is built on that idea of military aggression. So absolutely. But what he does, I suppose, still represent is the idea that it is possible to construct, to build a union, to achieve things. But I don't think he's got to be an anti-model. I think we should stop referring to him. I wish that Charlemagne Prize renamed itself, or the Karls Prize renamed itself to something else. I think it's a constant distraction. And I think we should be looking for another great political figure. I mean, whether we use someone like Monet, but why not? I mean, the person who began the dream of a new kind of Europe should be acknowledged. And heroes need to be built up and developed. We certainly need to junk him and find somebody else.
Wonderful, and thank you for an outstanding talk. Wonderful, really.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, very much. Well, I think we have got to bring it to a close there. I'm sure we'll all actually love to go on listening to Neil for another hour or two, but I'm afraid that's not possible. I'm already getting Neil's wonderful messages coming through saying, one of them I'm going to read to you. It was so good to feel that your mind and imagination were expanding while you were listening to him. This, I must say, I think will be very much a general feeling, Neil. That was such an extraordinarily broad and far-reaching talk, and really invaluable for our membership, and incredibly helpful for deep thinking about our mission in the year or years ahead. I'm very glad that the whole thing was recorded. I think Scott said at the beginning that it will be available on the website, which is splendid. So it just really remains to thank you, Neil, very much for all your work on that and for keeping us enormously absorbed and interested for such a long time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Richard, for inviting me, and thank you, the European movement, for existing. And I wish I'd been able to come up with some more credible and realistic proposals for how we go forward, but that we will go forward, I've got no doubt. And thank you very much. And thank you, the members of the movement, for everything that is being done and will be done. Thank you.
I would just like also to thank Scott and Michael very much for their technical assistance, which was absolutely essential and invaluable.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.